It was raining that afternoon, and Delaney Shaw left school later than usual. She saw him sitting by the gate of Bayard Hill Elementary, ragged, back against the brick wall, arms wrapped around his knees. He wasn't holding out his hand to anyone. People walked around him the way they'd walk around a dirty puddle, and he didn't even bother to look up. Delaney made it 5 steps before she stopped. In her bag was a sandwich she'd saved for dinner, and in her wallet was the last $20 she had her gas money for the week. She turned back, set both down beside him, and said, "Go on, eat." The man looked up. It wasn't the look of someone begging. It was the look of a man nobody had spoken to in a very long time. Then he said 3 words, hoarse and barely audible. "Thank you, ma'am." Delaney pulled up her collar and walked off into the rain. She had no idea those 3 words would change the entire course of her life. She had no idea that while she was spending her last dollars on a stranger, someone inside the school behind her was preparing to take away everything she had left. And she certainly had no idea that the ragged man sitting by that school gate was hiding something that, if the city of Baltimore ever found out, would leave no one brave enough to look him in the eye. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who still believes kindness is never wasted. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can keep walking through these stories together. The next morning, Delaney Shaw arrived at school at 7:20, earlier than usual, because her car's gas gauge was hovering near the red line, and she'd had to take a detour to the cheapest gas station in East Baltimore to put in exactly $4 worth. She unlocked the 4th grade classroom, turned on the lights, and began a day exactly like the 1,000 days that had come before it. There were 27 students in her class and 19 textbooks. She'd counted those numbers over and over for 4 years, and for 4 years, she'd still had to arrange the seats in exactly the same way, with 8 pairs of students sharing 1 book and the remaining 3 copying by hand from the board to keep up with the lesson. On the ceiling, directly above the 3rd row of desks, there was a brown stain that spread farther with every rainy season. The roof over the West Wing classrooms had been leaking for 3 years. Delaney had submitted a repair request last year, then filed another the year before, and both requests were still lying somewhere in a cabinet drawer in the administrative office. At 9 o'clock that morning, the rain began falling again, just as it had the previous afternoon. She placed a plastic bucket beneath the stain, moved 2 students' desks out of the way, and continued teaching. The children had grown so accustomed to it that not one of them even bothered to look up at the bucket anymore. During reading practice, she called on each child to read a passage aloud. When it was Micah Turner's turn, the boy seated at the 2nd desk in the middle row rose very slowly, both hands gripping the edge of his desk, and the rims of his ears turned red. 3 months earlier, he'd shaken his head fiercely every time she called his name. Today, he stood steady and read all 4 lines, slowly but without stumbling over a single word. The whole class applauded. Delaney nodded at him from the teacher's desk, and for that brief moment, she felt a little warmth inside her, the only thing that day that made her believe this work was still worth doing. At recess, after all the children had run outside to the schoolyard, she opened her desk drawer and took out a carton of milk and a pastry, 2 things she'd bought from the convenience store at 6 o'clock that morning, then walked to the 2nd desk in the middle row. She opened Micah's desk. Inside, there was only a notebook and a stubby pencil. The boy's backpack hung from the side of his desk, and she knew there was nothing in it because his mother worked 2 shifts at the hospital, leaving at 5 o'clock in the morning and returning after 9 o'clock at night. She placed the milk and pastry inside the desk, pushed them deep toward the back so the boy wouldn't see them right away, then closed it. She'd been doing this 3 mornings a week for 14 months, and she'd never said a single word to him about it. When she straightened up, Margie Doyle was standing in the doorway. Margie was 64 years old, had taught at Bayard Hill for 26 years, and was the only person at the school who still called Delaney child. She looked down at the desk Delaney had just closed, then looked at her. "You can't even take care of yourself, Delaney." Delaney didn't answer. She walked back toward the teacher's desk and straightened the stack of notebooks, while Margie remained there for another moment before leaving. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the dismissal bell rang. Delaney stayed behind to grade papers until 3:40, locked the classroom door, drove back to her apartment, showered for 10 minutes, and changed into another set of clothes. At exactly 6 o'clock, she arrived at the laundromat on Monument Street, tied back her hair, put on an apron, and began her night shift. The owner paid her $13 an hour, in cash, with no contract. She stood beside the industrial dryers folding other people's clothes until midnight, and during those 6 hours, she didn't sit down once. By the time she reached home, it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. She set her alarm for 5:30, then lay down. During those 4 brief hours of sleep, she didn't once think about the man who'd been sitting beside the school gate the previous afternoon. She was certain she'd never see him again. At 5:30 on Tuesday morning, the alarm went off, and Delaney rose at the very first sound because she'd been doing this for 8 months. She washed her face, made a cup of instant coffee, then drove to the apartment building 4 blocks away, where her younger brother lived in a rented room, even cheaper than hers. Wyatt Shaw was 19, and he was already waiting on the front steps with a cloth bag holding a thin blanket and a book. He got into the car, fastened his seatbelt, and neither of them spoke during the drive to the dialysis center on Broadway because they both knew that nothing they said would make any difference. When Delaney was 16, her parents walked out of the house one evening and never came back. From that day forward, she had only one person left in the world, and he was 7 years old at the time. She put college on hold for a year so she could work and support him, then returned to school at night. It took her 6 years to earn her teaching degree, and throughout those 6 years, there wasn't a single month when she got enough sleep. Wyatt grew up healthy and did well in school, but just as he began his first year at community college, he became ill. End-stage kidney failure. The doctor said he needed dialysis 3 times a week while he waited for a transplant, and at the time, the waiting list for a kidney in Maryland was more than 3 years long. At 6:15, she walked him into the treatment room. He settled into the familiar chair. The nurse inserted the needles, and Wyatt turned his face toward the ceiling as he always did. He lay there without moving for 4 hours. Delaney sat in the hallway outside, finishing the stack of 4th-grade papers she still had to mark, and every few minutes, she lifted her head to look through the glass. At 10:10, she helped him out. "You don't have to keep waiting for me. Some days I can take the bus by myself." Delaney didn't answer. She simply handed him a bottle of water and told him to drink. On the way out, she stopped at the cashier's desk, where the woman had seen her so many times that she no longer needed to ask her name. "Miss Shaw, the account for Wyatt Shaw is now 23 days past due. The outstanding balance is $4,210. Delaney handed her the installment payment application she had filled out the night before. The woman looked it over, then shook her head and said the previous application had already been denied. And this time, if the account passed 30 days, the system would automatically transfer the file to the collections department. Delaney folded the application, slipped it back into her bag, and said thank you. She had 7 days left. That afternoon, she taught 2 classes at noon and 1 more later in the day, then worked another shift at the laundromat that evening. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when she reached her apartment, and before putting the key into the lock, she paused for a moment in front of the door. A yellow sheet of paper was taped to it with clear tape, placed there by the property management company 2 weeks earlier, an eviction notice. 30 days, and now only 16 remained. She had torn it down once, then taped it back up because the law required the original notice to remain in its original place until the matter was resolved, so she did something else. She peeled away the tape, turned the paper over, then fastened it back in exactly the same place with the blank side facing outward. That way, every morning when she stepped out of her home, she would see nothing but a blank sheet of paper. She knew perfectly well what was written on the other side. But on some mornings, not having to see the words was the one small kindness she could still give herself. She went inside, placed the stack of bills on the dining table, and didn't touch them again for the rest of the night. On Thursday morning, Delaney went to the administrative office to ask for more printer paper because the 4th grade had run out the week before, and she'd been forced to write the test questions on the board for 27 children to copy by hand. The office clerk told her to sit and wait, then handed her a thick folder and said that if she wanted to request anything, she had to fill out the attached form and include the most recent quarterly expenditure report. Delaney carried the folder down to the teacher's lounge, sat at the corner of a table, and while she waited for the lunch break to end, she began to read. Bayard Hill's school supply fund for that year was $91,000, administered by Assistant Principal Priscilla Dunn. She read from top to bottom. 140 boxes of pencils, 60 cases of printer paper, 32 science experiment kits. Then she stopped at a line near the bottom of the second page. 12 digital projectors, priced at $1,100 each, for a total of $13,200, with the purchase dated in August. Delaney read that line 3 times. She'd taught at this school for 4 years. Her classroom had never had a projector. There wasn't a single one in the entire West Wing, and whenever teachers needed to show something on a screen, they still had to schedule time to borrow the one old projector kept in the library. That afternoon, she walked through both floors, looked into every classroom, and counted exactly one projector in the entire school. She photocopied the page, then went upstairs and knocked on the principal's door. Howard Kessler was 62 years old, 2 years away from retirement, and he sat behind his desk, wearing the expression of a man who wanted nothing more than for no one to walk through his door. "Sir, may I ask where these 12 projectors are now?" Kessler picked up the paper, glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds, then set it down without reading it. "The accounts are Miss Dunn's responsibility. But sir, $13,200 could buy books for 3 classrooms, while the 27 students in my class have to share 19 copies." Kessler pushed the paper back toward her, and for the first time, he raised his eyes to meet hers. "Miss Shaw, leave it here. I'll look into it." Delaney knew he wouldn't. She thanked him and walked out. 3 hours later, the intercom called her name and told her to report to the assistant principal's office. Priscilla Dunn was 48 years old, had worked at Bayard Hill for 17 years, and had a particular way of smiling, with her mouth but never with her eyes. She pointed to the chair across from her, and on the desk between them lay the photocopy Delaney had given Kessler 3 hours earlier. "Miss Shaw, I hear you've taken an interest in the school's accounts. I only asked one question. How many years have you been here now?" 4 years. Priscilla nodded slowly, then reached across the desk and tapped her index finger exactly 3 times, each tap evenly spaced, neither fast nor slow. "You're still young, Miss Shaw. There are things here that are best left unseen." Delaney sat in silence. Priscilla picked up the photocopy, folded it in half, slipped it into her desk drawer, and closed it. "Go back to your class." Delaney stepped into the hallway with a cold sensation creeping down the back of her neck, and she'd made it halfway to her classroom when Margie Doyle emerged from the room next door and stopped her. Margie glanced toward the office door that had just closed, then lowered her voice. "You've just stirred up a hornet's nest, Delaney. 12 projectors can't simply disappear." Margie looked at her for a long time. "I've worked here for 26 years. I've seen 3 people ask the very same question you just asked. None of them teaches in Baltimore anymore." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Delaney standing alone in the middle of the hallway, still holding the printer paper request form she hadn't had a chance to submit. 4 days after the conversation in the assistant principal's office, Delaney finished class at 3:40 and walked out through the school gate, as she always did. It wasn't raining, but the wind was cold, and when she passed the brick wall on the east side, she saw him. He was in the same place, leaning against the wall as before, both arms wrapped around his knees. She'd been certain she would never see him again. Delaney walked straight to her car, opened the trunk, took out the coat she'd left there that morning, then stopped at the coffee shop on the corner and bought a cup of hot black coffee. The coat had belonged to her father. She'd kept it for 12 years, had never worn it once, and had never been able to bring herself to throw it away. That morning, she'd opened the closet, stared at it for a long time, then carried it down to the car. She returned to the brick wall and set the coffee beside him, then folded the coat and placed it on top. "Put it on. The wind is cold." The man looked at the coat, then at her. "You came back." "I teach at this school. I walk past here every day." He held the coffee cup in both hands as though he were afraid he might lose it, and Delaney saw that his knuckles were red from the cold. "My name is Delaney." He was silent for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Nico." "Just Nico?" "Just Nico." She sat on the step a short distance from him and placed her cloth bag beside her. "How long have you been here?" "Long enough to get used to it." "Do you have a family?" "I did. Then I lost them." He said it in a perfectly flat voice, without a trace of self-pity, and that emptiness hurt Delaney more than it would have if he'd cried. Then he turned toward her and asked a question no one had ever asked before. "Why are you helping me?" Delaney sat in silence. The wind swept through the school gate, sending a few dry leaves tumbling along the sidewalk. "Because once, I needed someone to help me, and no one came." The man turned fully toward her, and for the first time, he looked directly into her eyes. "Then I hope you'll never need help again." For the next 3 weeks, Delaney stopped by every afternoon. Some days, she brought him a bowl of chicken soup from the shop on the corner. Other days, she brought only a bottle of water and a few crackers. Sometimes, she brought nothing at all, and simply sat beside him for 15 minutes before leaving. He never asked her for anything, That was what she noticed most. Everyone asked for something eventually, even the kindest people, yet he never did. He accepted whatever she gave him, said thank you, and left it at that. She told him how Micah Turner had finally found the courage to stand and read aloud in front of the class after 3 months. She told him about 27 children sharing 19 textbooks, and about the plastic bucket catching rainwater beneath the 3rd row of desks. She told him about Wyatt, about Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, and about the 4 hours her brother lay still, staring at the ceiling. "What are you most afraid of?" It took Delaney a while to answer. "I'm afraid that one day I'll get there too late." He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He didn't tell her everything would be all right, and he didn't tell her how strong she was. He simply sat there and listened, and only later did Delaney understand that this was exactly what she'd been missing for 12 years. That night, after she'd gone, the man beside the brick wall rose at 11:40. He took off the ragged coat he wore over his clothes, folded it neatly, hid it in a gap behind the wall, then walked 2 blocks east and turned into the alley behind the auto repair shop. A black Suburban was waiting there with its engine running. A broad-shouldered man of about 55 with graying hair stood beside the vehicle, opened the rear door, and bowed his head slightly. "Boss." Nico climbed inside. "Anything, Bruno?" the Marchetti family asked again. 3rd time this month. Nico looked through the window toward Bayard Hill School, which stood dark except for a single hallway light. "Bruno?" "Yes." "Put 2 men on the route she takes to her night job. Monument Street, then the turn onto Wolf. She gets off at midnight and walks 3 blocks. Don't let her know." Bruno hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "And what about you, boss?" "No one comes near that corner." Bruno raised his eyes and looked at his boss through the rearview mirror. "Even if I need help." On the first Monday morning in November, Delaney went up to the administrative office to collect her teaching schedule for the new term as usual. The clerk handed her the sheet without looking at her, and Delaney read it once from beginning to end, right there at the counter, then read it a second time more slowly. Her teaching load had been cut from 25 periods to 18. All 7 periods that had been removed were morning classes, and every one of them came with additional teaching pay. In their place, her name had been assigned to remedial classes at the end of the day, from 3:30 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 days a week, with the compensation column left blank. Delaney stared at those 3 days for a long time. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. The exact 3 days she drove Wyatt to dialysis. She picked up the schedule and knocked on the principal's door. Howard Kessler was looking at his computer screen, and he didn't raise his head when she entered. "Sir, may I ask why my teaching schedule has been changed?" "Assignments are at the administration's discretion, Miss Shaw." "I understand, but these 3 remedial classes fall at the exact time I have to take my younger brother to dialysis, and the 7 morning periods that were cut are the part of my income I've been using to pay his medical bills." Kessler pressed a few more keys before finally stopping. He removed his glasses, folded the arms, set them on the desk, and this time he looked at her. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was no sympathy either. There was only the weariness of a man who wanted the final 2 years of his working life to pass without trouble. "Miss Shaw, let me ask you something." "Yes, sir." "Did you bring a sheet of paper up here last week?" Delaney fell silent. "You're young. This school is old. You understand what I mean, don't you?" She stood there for several more seconds. She had prepared 3 answers in her head, and every one of them was true. She could have said that $13,200 belonged to the children. She could have said that she hadn't missed a single day of teaching in 4 years. She could have asked what it was called when a teacher's schedule was cut, because she'd asked one question. But at that moment, she had $11 left in her wallet. There were 16 days remaining on the eviction notice posted on her apartment door. Wyatt's medical account was 7 days away from being transferred to collections. And if she lost the remaining 18 periods as well, there would be nothing left. So Delaney folded the schedule in half, slipped it into her bag, and said, "Thank you, sir." She walked out into the hallway, and she didn't argue a single word. That afternoon, she taught her first remedial class until 5 o'clock, then drove straight to the dialysis center to pick up Wyatt. He'd been waiting outside for more than an hour because she hadn't been able to take him that morning, and he'd had to ride 2 buses there on his own. He got into the car and didn't ask her anything. He only said, "Don't worry about me. I can get there by myself." Delaney nodded and pulled away. At 5:45, she dropped him off, then drove straight to the laundromat without having time to go home and change. That night, She stood beside the dryers in the clothes she'd worn to teach, calculating next month's money over and over in her head. Losing 7 periods meant losing about $460 a month. She was used to this by now. But it still hurt. That Friday, Delaney finished remedial class at 5:10. Darkness had already fallen early, and inside her cloth bag was a container of soup from the corner shop, still warm. She walked around toward the school gate as she did every afternoon. The space beside the brick wall was empty. She stopped and stared at that emptiness for a moment. In 3 weeks, there hadn't been a single day when he wasn't there. Nico. No one answered. She followed the wall toward the back, where a narrow alley ran between the school and an old parking lot that had long since been abandoned. And there she found him. Nico was lying on his side on the concrete, one hand pressed tightly against his ribs, his body curled inward. The container of soup fell from Delaney's bag and struck the ground. She dropped to her knees beside him, and her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't pull her phone from her coat pocket. Nico, can you hear me? Who did this to you? He tried to open his eyes and look at her, and she could see that it took him a moment to recognize who she was. Some men cornered me in the alley. They said this place wasn't mine. I told them I didn't have anywhere else. Lie still. I'm calling an ambulance. His hand seized her wrist. It was icy cold, but his grip was painfully tight. Don't call. I don't have insurance. I don't have anything. I didn't ask what you have. He still wouldn't release her, and Delaney heard her own voice break apart in the darkness of the alley. Be quiet, she screamed. It was the first time in 4 years that she'd screamed at anyone, and the sound struck the concrete wall and came rushing back at her, startling even Delaney herself. Nico released her wrist. Lean on me. Slowly. She slipped her shoulder beneath his arm and used the full weight of her body to lift him. He stood a head taller than she did and weighed half again as much, and every time she shifted, he held his breath against the pain. They walked 4 blocks to Dr. Hollis's private clinic on Broadway. Those 4 blocks felt as long as 4 years. Dr. Hollis took x-rays and examined him, then came out to meet her in the hallway. 2 broken ribs, a split lip, and possibly a mild concussion. He needs stitches, x-rays, medication, and overnight observation. $780. Do you have insurance for him? Delaney stood perfectly still. $780. She had $820 in her account, and that was the money she'd saved to pay for Wyatt's medication the following month. She heard herself speak with perfect calm, as though the voice belonged to someone else. I'll pay. Inside the examination room, Nico tried to push himself upright on the table. Delaney, no, you can't do this. Lie down. Listen to me. Be quiet and let them treat you. He looked at her for a long time, then slowly lay back down. At 11 o'clock that night, while Delaney crossed the street to buy water from the store opposite the clinic, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair stepped inside and stopped at the foot of the bed. Bruno Sarti said nothing for the first few seconds. His hands clenched into fists, then opened again. I gave the order, Bruno. You did what you were told. I did what I was told. The older man's voice grew hoarse. I haven't disobeyed you once in 12 years. But today, I'm going to say it. That order was wrong. You're standing here looking at me, and you're telling me you did the right thing? Nico didn't answer. Beyond the glass door, Delaney was crossing the street with 2 bottles of water in her hands. Go. Bruno looked toward her, then back at his boss, and left through the rear door exactly 30 seconds before she walked inside. At nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Hollis said he shouldn't be out on the street for at least a week, and Delaney stood in the clinic hallway, staring into the dark parking lot as she tried to work out what choices she had left. The nearest shelter was 6 miles away and was always full. She couldn't even bring herself to think about the alley. She turned and went back into the room. You're coming home with me. No, Nico, you're a woman living alone. You don't know who I am. Delaney looked straight into the one eye he could still open. I know you haven't asked me for a single cent in 3 weeks. That's enough for me. Besides, you've got 2 broken ribs, so you're in no condition to argue with me. She helped him up to the 3rd floor by the stairs because the building's elevator had been broken since summer, and every step took nearly a minute. She slipped the key into the lock, pushed open the door, then turned on the light. Nico stepped inside and stopped in the middle of the living room. For 12 years, this man had walked into rooms where a single set of furniture cost more than the entire building in which he now stood. But he'd never stood in a room like this one. The first thing he saw was the stack of papers on the dining table, From where he stood, he could clearly read the bold print at the top, and beneath it was a number. $4,210. Beside it lay a handwritten installment payment application, filled out in neat writing, with a red stamp in the lower right corner. Denied. His eyes moved to the refrigerator door. A monthly calendar was fastened there, and 3 days each week had been circled in red, traced over so many times that the ink had eaten through the paper. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. For 3 weeks, she'd sat beside him on those steps and told him about those 3 mornings, and he'd listened, but hearing her describe them was different from standing inside this room and seeing them with his own eyes. Then he turned and looked at the front door that had just closed behind him. A white sheet of paper was taped to the inside of it with clear tape, all 4 corners pressed perfectly flat. The ceiling light shone down, and through the thin paper, the bold letters printed on the other side appeared backward, faint, but still clear enough to read. He stood there staring at that sheet of paper for a very long time. This woman had turned an eviction notice backward simply so she wouldn't have to look at it every morning, and for the past 3 weeks, she'd still brought him a bowl of soup every single day. Delaney walked over to take the paper down. "Don't pay attention to any of that. You gave me $780. His voice was very quiet. "When you're short $4,200, that's my problem." She went into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Inside were half a carton of eggs, an almost empty bottle of milk, and a can of tomatoes. She took down the tomatoes, set a pot on the stove, and 20 minutes later, she carried out a bowl of soup and placed it in front of him. "Eat. It's hot." Nico looked at the bowl of soup. He looked at it for a long time. In 12 years, hundreds of people had poured him wine that cost $4,000 a bottle and served him meals worth more than Delaney earned in an entire month. But no one had ever cooked for him with the last food left in their home. He picked up the spoon, and that hand trembled. "Are you in pain?" "No." He finished every drop of the soup without saying another word. Delaney took out a blanket and spread it over the sofa, turned off some of the lights, then went into the bedroom. The man remained alone in the middle of that room, facing the door with the blank sheet of paper taped backward against it, and he stayed awake until morning. Nico stayed in that apartment for 6 days. Every morning before leaving for work, Delaney set out his medication and a glass of water on the table, and every evening when she came home, she found the blanket folded into a perfect square and the glass washed and turned upside down on the rack. On the 2nd day, he managed to get up and walk on his own. On the 4th, he washed every dish in the sink even though she'd told him not to do anything. On the 3rd night, she came home at 12:30, still carrying the smell of laundry soap on her clothes, and found him sitting in the dark. "Can't you sleep?" "I don't sleep much." She sat down in the chair across from him, took off her shoes, and for the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. How was Wyatt today? His numbers were worse than last week. The doctor said they might have to increase it to 4 sessions a week. "How much will it cost?" "Nico, I'm only asking." "Why are you asking? Are you planning to pay it for me?" She said it lightly, almost as a joke, but he didn't smile. He lowered his eyes to the hands resting on his knees. "Delaney, in the 6 days I've been here, you haven't asked me a single question." "What question?" "Where I came from, what I used to do, how I ended up like this." He raised his head. "Everyone asks. You don't." Delaney was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to tell me?" "No." "Then why would I ask?" "People still ask, even when they know the other person doesn't want to answer." She drew her legs up onto the chair, wrapped her arms around her knees, and looked out the window, where there was nothing but the murky yellow glow of a single street lamp. "Everyone has a story they don't want to tell. So do I." "What story?" Delaney laughed. "You just said people ask about things others don't want to talk about." For the first time in 6 days, she saw the corner of his mouth lift. On the 5th night, when she came home and sat in that chair as though it had already become a ritual, he asked her another question. "Have you ever regretted being kind to someone?" Delaney thought of the photocopied sheet folded in half and placed inside a drawer. She thought of the 7 teaching periods that had been taken away. She thought of the $11 in her wallet that day. "Yes." "Then why do you keep doing it?" She was silent for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. "When I was 16, I once stood in a place where I needed someone to help me. People walked past. People saw me. No one stopped." Delaney rested her chin on her knees. "I don't want to become the kind of person I once prayed I wouldn't meet." Nico said nothing. He sat there, and she sat there. And after a while, she fell asleep in the chair, still wearing her work clothes. When she woke in the morning, his blanket was draped over her, while he sat upright at the far end of the sofa without one, his eyes still open. On Saturday morning, the alarm went off at 5:30. Delaney got up, walked into the living room, and stopped in the doorway. The sofa was empty. The blanket had been folded into a perfect square and placed at one end. The glass was turned upside down on the dish rack, and her father's old coat hung neatly on the hook beside the door, smooth and carefully arranged, as though no one had ever worn it. There was no note, not a single word. She stood in the middle of the living room for a very long time. Then she opened the door, looked down the third-floor hallway, walked the entire length of it, took the stairs, and went all the way out to the building's entrance. The streets were deserted that Saturday morning. In Delaney's life, people leaving was an ordinary thing. When she was 16, 2 people left at the same time. Her college friends left when she dropped out. The man she loved when she was 24 left 3 weeks after learning that she had a sick younger brother to support. She was used to people leaving, but this time, it hurt in a different way. Because this time, she didn't even know who she was supposed to remember. She didn't know how old he was, where he'd been born, or whether he had anyone in this world. She knew only one name, and that name was only one word. At 6:15, she took Wyatt into the dialysis room. That afternoon, on her way home, she still drove past the gate of Bayard Hill School. The space beside the brick wall was empty, and from that day forward, it remained empty. The following Tuesday, Delaney took Wyatt to the dialysis center, and inside her bag was the installment payment application she'd filled out for the 3rd time, because that day marked the 30th day. She approached the cashier's desk with the resignation of someone who already knew what the answer would be. The clerk entered the account number into the computer, looked at the screen, then raised her head. "Miss Shaw, the account for the patient Wyatt Shaw has been paid in full." Delaney thought she'd misheard. "Could you please say that again?" The entire outstanding balance of $4,210 was paid last Friday. In addition, an advance deposit has been made to cover the next 12 months of treatment, including medication. She had to place one hand on the counter to steady herself. Who paid it? The funds were transferred through a law office. The person who made the payment requested that their identity remain confidential. "Give me the phone number for that office." "I'm sorry, but the file specifically states that no information is to be disclosed." Delaney stood there for another moment, then thanked her and walked away. Throughout the drive home, Wyatt kept asking what was wrong with her, and she only shook her head. On Wednesday afternoon, she reached her apartment and stopped in front of the door. The white sheet of paper taped backward against it was gone. Only 2 old strips of tape remained on the wood. She called the property management company from the hallway. "Yes, Miss Shaw? The eviction order was withdrawn yesterday. All overdue rent has been paid in full, and your lease has been extended for another 2 years at the same rate." "Who did that?" "We don't have that information. Everything was handled through a legal representative." Delaney inserted the key into the lock, and it took her 3 tries to open the door, because her hand no longer seemed willing to obey her. On Friday morning, Principal Kessler summoned the entire faculty to the auditorium. He held the microphone with his face flushed red, and in the 4 years Delaney had worked at that school, she'd never seen him so happy. "Ladies and gentlemen, this morning Bayard Hill School received a donation from an anonymous benefactor, $40,000. A wave of astonishment swept through the auditorium. Kessler put on his glasses and raised the sheet of paper high. "And I'd like to read the accompanying note exactly as it was written. For the 4th grade class, where 27 students are sharing 19 textbooks, and for the roof over the west classroom wing." The auditorium fell utterly silent. There was no name written anywhere in that note. But Bayard Hill had only one 4th grade class, and every one of the 40 people sitting in the auditorium that morning knew exactly who taught it. One head after another turned toward her. Delaney sat in the 4th row with both hands resting in her lap, and she felt all the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Margie Doyle leaned closer and whispered, "Who do you know, Delaney?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because she didn't know. She truly didn't know. In the front row, Assistant Principal Priscilla Dunn slowly turned her head. She stared directly at Delaney across 4 rows of seats, and she smiled. Her mouth smiled, but her eyes didn't. Early the following Monday morning, heavy rain began falling at 4 o'clock, and Delaney's car died in the hospital parking lot after she took Wyatt into the dialysis room. She stood beneath the awning at the main entrance and called 3 roadside assistance services, but all 3 told her she'd have to wait at least 2 hours. She had to be at school by 7:45. Just then, a black Suburban pulled up to the curb, and the driver stepped out and opened an umbrella over her. "Miss Shaw, I'm here to take you to school." "Who called a car for me?" "This ride has already been paid for, ma'am." Delaney stood motionless beneath the rain for several seconds. She'd intended to refuse, but she was already late for class. Her clothes were soaked up to her shoulders, and she didn't have enough money in her wallet to call another car. She got in. Across the street, beneath the awning of the coffee shop opposite the hospital entrance, Bethany Cole was waiting to buy a drink, with her phone raised at eye level. Bethany was 32, taught 5th grade at Bayard Hill, and was the same woman who always asked to copy Delaney's lesson plans at the beginning of every semester. She took 3 photographs. By 9 o'clock that morning, the clearest of those 3 photographs had appeared in the group chat for the entire Bayard Hill faculty. Black car, tinted windows, driver opening the door. Who's driving her around, I wonder? Probably her boyfriend. What kind of boyfriend drives a car like that? By 10 o'clock, someone had placed the photograph beside a screenshot of the $40,000 donation notice Principal Kessler had read aloud in the auditorium the previous Friday. No one wrote another word beneath it. No one needed to. At 12:15, Delaney walked into the teacher's lounge. 4 people were sitting at the center table, and all 4 of them fell silent at the same moment. She went to the coffee pot, filled her cup, and the sound of coffee pouring into it seemed unbearably loud. "Delaney," Bethany spoke in a voice as sweet as sugar, "I'm honestly asking, where did you get the money to pay $4,200 in medical bills? I didn't pay it. Then who did?" "I don't know." Bethany laughed and turned to look at the other 3. "You don't know who paid $4,200 for you?" Delaney set down her cup. She could have told them that she'd stood at the hospital cashier's desk and asked that exact question 3 times, and no one had given her an answer. She could have told them that for 4 years, she'd worked 2 shifts a day and hadn't missed a single day of teaching. But she looked around the room and understood something. Not one of those 4 people was asking because they wanted to hear the answer. So she picked up her coffee and walked out. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, when the teacher's lounge was at its most crowded, Priscilla Dunn walked in carrying a cup of tea. She stopped in the middle of the room, blew gently across its surface, and began speaking to everyone, without looking at Delaney even once. "You know, I've worked in education for 17 years. A teacher earns $41,000 a year. You can calculate for yourselves how much is left after taxes." She took a sip of tea. And yet suddenly someone's dialysis bills are paid in full. Suddenly the eviction problem disappears. Suddenly a private car with a driver is taking her straight to the school entrance. Then, just as suddenly, $40,000 falls directly into one classroom. Priscilla set her cup down on the table. "I'm not talking about anyone in particular. You can draw your own conclusions." Then she walked out. No one in the room said a word. Delaney remained in the same place, one hand resting on the stack of ungraded notebooks, and she sat there for another 10 minutes before rising. From that day forward, every time she entered the teacher's lounge, the room fell silent. Over the past 4 years, she'd lost many things, but this was the first time she'd lost something she couldn't buy back by working another night shift. Word spread beyond the school gates within 9 days. At first, the parents waiting for their children in the yard after dismissal began standing a little farther away from her. Then 2 mothers didn't return her greeting when she nodded to them. Then, on Thursday morning, just as Delaney closed the classroom door after the first lesson, Mrs. Turner was waiting for her in the hallway. She was still wearing her blue hospital uniform, her hair hastily tied back, and in her hand was a form that had already been filled out. She stood 3 steps away from Delaney and didn't dare look her directly in the eyes. "Miss Shaw, I'd like permission to transfer Micah into Miss Bethany's class." Delaney looked at the form in her hand. "Mrs. Turner, may I ask why?" "People are saying all kinds of things, Miss Shaw." "What are they saying?" "Mrs." Turner lowered her face. "I work double shifts at Hopkins. I don't have time to listen to gossip, but for the past 3 days, everyone at the school gate has been talking. They say you're mixed up in some kind of money trouble. I don't know whether it's true, and I don't want to know. But my boy has only one job, and that's to learn. If something happens later, I won't be able to bear the consequences. Mrs. Turner, please listen to just one thing. 3 months ago, Micah was too afraid to stand in front of the class. Every time I called his name, he shook his head. For the past 3 months, I've spent 15 minutes with him at lunch every day, helping him practice his reading. And last week, he stood up and read all 4 lines in front of 26 classmates. The entire class applauded him. Delaney heard her own voice beginning to tremble. If you move him now, he'll have to begin all over again with a new teacher and 30 new classmates. He'll go back to sitting in silence. I know he will. Mrs. Turner kept her face lowered. I'm sorry, Miss Shaw. She placed the form on the hallway windowsill, then turned and walked away quickly, and Delaney remained there watching until she disappeared around the bend in the staircase. She picked up the form. The parent's signature had already been signed at home. That meant Mrs. Turner had made her decision the night before, and nothing Delaney had just said had made any difference at all. On Friday afternoon, when the final lesson ended and all 26 children had run out into the yard, Delaney stayed behind alone in the classroom. She walked between the 2 rows of desks, straightened the chairs, and picked up scraps of paper from the floor, doing the same things she did every afternoon. Then she stopped at the second desk in the middle row. The chair was empty. The inside of the desk had been cleared out that morning. There were no notebooks left, not even a worn-down pencil. Delaney returned to the teacher's desk and opened the drawer. Inside was a carton of milk and a pastry she'd bought at 6 o'clock that morning. Bought out of habit. Bought before she knew. She picked them up, rose from her chair, and took 3 steps toward the middle row. Then she stopped. She went back to her desk, placed the milk and the pastry inside the drawer, and pushed it closed. For the past 14 months, she'd done this 3 times a week, without ever saying a word to the boy, because she hadn't wanted him to know. Now he truly never would. Delaney sat down in her chair. The classroom was empty, and the only sound was water dripping from the stain on the ceiling into the plastic bucket beneath the 3rd row of desks, steady and slow. In the 4 years she'd stood in that room, she'd never cried in front of anyone. She hadn't cried when 7 of her teaching periods were taken away. She hadn't cried when she stood in the teacher's lounge listening to people talk about her without ever saying her name. But that afternoon, sitting alone in her own classroom and staring at the empty chair beside the second desk in the middle row, Delaney lowered her head onto the desk and wept. At 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, in the final week of November, the intercom summoned Delaney Shaw to the boardroom. She left her class with the teacher on duty and walked down the hallway, and she already knew what was waiting for her before she opened the door. There were 7 people in the room. Principal Kessler sat in the middle. Priscilla Dunn sat to his right with a gray folder in front of her. 4 members of the school board sat along both sides of the table, and at the far end sat a man in a gray suit whom Delaney had never seen before, who introduced himself as the district compliance officer. Please sit down, Miss Shaw. Priscilla opened the folder. Miss Shaw, the board has received a complaint regarding the grant of $40,000. A complaint against whom? Against you. Delaney thought she'd misheard. I'm sorry. Could you please say that again? Priscilla pushed a sheet of paper toward her. This money was transferred into the school's account by an unidentified legal entity, with instructions that it be used for one specific classroom and no other. There is no grant agreement, no named donor, and no documentation of any kind establishing where the funds came from. The money went into the school. It didn't disappear. No one said it did. Priscilla folded her hands on the table. What the board is examining isn't the school's money. What the board is examining is the code of professional ethics. A teacher may not accept personal benefits from an unidentified third party. I haven't accepted anything. Over the past 6 weeks, someone has paid $4,210 in medical bills for your younger brother, paid all of your overdue rent, and provided a car to take you directly to the school entrance. Priscilla raised her eyes. That comes to more than $55,000. And you're sitting here telling the board that you don't know who did it? That's correct. Then let me ask you this. She took a photocopied sheet folded in half from the folder, opened it, and placed it in the center of the table. Delaney recognized it immediately. It was the classroom supply fund expense statement she'd given Principal Kessler the previous month, the same sheet he'd folded and placed inside a drawer right in front of her. In October, Miss Shaw brought this document to the administration and challenged the school's accounting records. In November, Miss Shaw received more than $55,000 from a source she claims not to know. Priscilla looked around the table. I'll leave it to the board to decide what motive a person in such financial circumstances might have for questioning the school's accounts. Delaney sat motionless. And at that exact moment, she finally understood what Priscilla was doing. She wasn't accusing Delaney of stealing a single cent. She only needed the 7 people in that room to believe that if Delaney was corrupt, then Delaney's questions must be corrupt as well. At the back of the room, Margie Doyle sprang to her feet. "I object. This young woman has taught here for 4 years, worked 2 shifts a day, and hasn't missed a single day. Has anyone sitting in this room ever asked how she survives? Miss Doyle." Priscilla never raised her voice. "You're not a member of the board. Please leave the room." Margie looked at Delaney. Delaney gave a slight shake of her head. Margie remained standing for another 2 seconds, then walked out, and the door closed very softly behind her. Principal Kessler cleared his throat and read from a prepared statement. "Miss Shaw, pending verification, the board has decided to suspend you without pay, effective today. Sir, I still have 26 children sitting in my classroom. Miss Cole will take over." Delaney rose to her feet. Her hands were trembling, but she tried to keep the tremor out of her voice. "May I ask one last question before I leave?" No one answered. "During the past 6 weeks, did anyone in this room ask me where I was finding the money to pay for my brother's treatment?" The room fell silent. The 4 board members lowered their eyes to the table. The man in the gray suit looked out the window. Principal Kessler straightened the stack of papers in front of him, though it was already perfectly aligned. "No one asked," Delaney said. But the moment money appeared, the entire school started asking questions. She picked up her bag and walked out. At 10 o'clock, just as recess began, she carried a box of her belongings down the hallway, while students poured out on both sides and teachers stood in their classroom doorways watching her pass. Not one person said a word to her. When she reached the gate, she walked past the eastern brick wall, where the space beside the corner was still empty, and she never once turned back to look at it. 3 days later, Delaney still returned to the gates of Bayard Hill School. Not to go inside. She no longer had the right to walk through those gates. It was only that every afternoon at 3 o'clock, her body instinctively wanted to be there, and she didn't know what else to do with that stretch of time. She stood across the street, leaning against the side of her car, watching the children pour into the schoolyard, while calculating where she might apply for work the following month. No salary meant nothing at all. The laundromat paid $13 an hour and offered only 6 hours of work each night. At exactly 3:15, she heard the sound of engines. 3 black sport utility vehicles came slowly down Wolf Street, turned in, and stopped in a line directly in front of the main gate. Everyone in the schoolyard turned to look. The parents waiting for their children moved closer to the wall. The 2 teachers stationed at the gate stepped backward. The doors of the first and last vehicles opened before the others, and 4 men stepped out and stood where they were. None of them approached the gate. Then the door of the middle vehicle opened. Bruno Sardi stepped out, walked around to the rear, opened the door, and bent slightly at the waist. "Mr. Ferraro, sir." Delaney heard those 3 words clearly from across the street. The man who stepped out wore a black suit and a white shirt with no tie. His black hair was cut short. He fastened one button on his jacket, raised his head, and the afternoon sunlight fell across his face. Along the left side of his jaw was a faint scar that ran down toward his neck. Delaney had once sat exactly 1 meter from that scar in her own kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning, when she placed a bowl of soup in front of him. She stood frozen beside her car. In Baltimore, there were certain family names people mentioned only after lowering their voices. Ferraro was one of them. Over the past 10 years, she'd heard that name on the city news no fewer than 30 times, always accompanied by words like investigation, harbor, and insufficient grounds for prosecution. She'd never imagined she would one day see the face that belonged to that name. Behind her, on the steps across the street, came the sound of porcelain shattering against brick. Priscilla Dunn had just emerged from the main entrance with a cup of tea in her hand. She stopped. The cup slipped from her fingers and broke into pieces at her feet. She didn't bend down to pick it up. She took 1 step backward, gripped the railing, then collapsed onto the stone bench beside the door. Nico crossed the street. Not quickly, not slowly. No one stepped forward to block his path. He stopped 2 paces from Delaney. "Delaney." She couldn't speak. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Who are you?" "Nico Ferraro." He spoke his name calmly, as though he were stating something self-evident. 3 months ago, I was sitting beside that wall. That's the only truth I kept from you." "The only truth?" Delaney heard her own voice break. "I bandaged your wounds. I let you sleep on my sofa for 6 days. I spent the money meant for my brother's medication to pay your hospital bill, all while you had those 3 cars parked somewhere outside. Yes. Is that all you're going to say? Nico looked at her. I want to explain, but not in the middle of the schoolyard, in front of the people who just threw you out of this place. He glanced toward the steps across the street, where Priscilla was still sitting on the stone bench, too afraid to raise her head. Then he turned back to Delaney. Give me 1 hour. If, after that hour, you tell me to leave, I'll leave, and you'll never see me again. They sat in a small cafe on Fleet Street, and there was no one else inside but the 2 of them. Bruno stood outside the door with his back to the cafe. Nico placed both hands on the table. My father's name was Aldo Ferraro. He came to America when he was 19 and worked as a longshoreman at the port of Baltimore. By the time he was 40, he controlled that port. When I was 22, he went to dinner in Little Italy and never came home that night. Delaney sat in silence. I didn't choose this name. I inherited it, along with 200 men and everything my father left behind. He slowly turned the cup on the table. For the next 12 years, every woman who entered my life saw exactly the same thing. What? The name. Not me. 3 years ago, someone told me she loved me, and I believed her. 6 months later, Bruno placed a piece of paper on my desk. She had an arrangement with a group in Philadelphia. She was supposed to marry me, and then take information from me. What did you do to her? I put her on a plane, and told her never to come back. Nico lifted his eyes. What did you think I did? Delaney didn't answer. After that, I didn't trust anyone again. Then last summer, Bruno said something to me. He told me that as long as I carried this name, I would never know whether there was anyone in this world who was truly kind, so I left the name behind. Nico nodded. 4 months. I took no money, no identification, and no one with me. I sat on 7 different street corners in this city. Bruno was allowed to know only that I was still alive at the end of each day. And then, during those 4 months, 218 people stopped long enough to look at me. I counted every one of them. Delaney looked at him. 4 gave me money. 3 of those 4 held up their phones to record themselves while they did it. Another woman told me to move somewhere else, because I was making the sidewalk in front of her store dirty. Someone spat at my feet. 2 children pointed at me, and their mother pulled them away as quickly as she could. I don't blame that mother, because if I'd been in her place, I would have done the same thing. Of the first 217 people, not one asked my name. And the 218th? Nico looked directly into her eyes. The 218th left behind her dinner and the last $20 in her wallet, then walked away without waiting for me to thank her. Delaney had to lower her eyes to the table. You didn't give me money because you pitied me. If that had been all, you would have been no different from the other 4. For 3 weeks you sat down on those steps and told me about your class. You asked whether I'd slept the night before. You never asked how I'd ended up that way. And in 4 months, you were the only person who didn't ask me that question. Because I thought you had nothing. Exactly. Nico nodded. Because you thought I had nothing. Delaney sat silently for a moment, then raised her head, and her voice hardened. What about the $40,000? Nico didn't look away. That was me. Do you have any idea what's happening to me at that school? I do. I've known since Tuesday. Then why did you send it? He was silent for several seconds, and for the first time during their entire conversation, she saw him struggle to find the words. For 3 weeks, you sat there and told me about your classroom. You told me there was a plastic bucket catching rainwater beneath the 3rd row of desks. You told me the roof over the west classroom wing had been leaking for 3 years. You told me there were 27 children in your class, and only 19 books, which meant 8 pairs had to share. I heard that number one afternoon in October. He placed one hand on the table. All I could think about was 27 children sharing 19 books. I wasn't thinking about you. Delaney stared at him. I deliberately left your name out of the note, because I thought that would protect you. I've spent 12 years in a world where money arrives hand in hand with silence. I didn't understand that $40,000 could make so much noise inside a school. I sent that money for 27 children, and you were the one who paid the price. That was my fault, Delaney, and there's no other way for me to say it. Delaney didn't sleep that night. She sat at the dining table with the stack of settled bills spread before her, turning each page over and over as though somewhere among them was an answer she hadn't yet seen. $4,210 in hospital bills, $11,000 in overdue rent, $40,000 for a school. For 4 years, she'd stood before 27 children and taught them the simplest things. If something doesn't belong to you, you don't take it. If you do something wrong, you have to admit it. There are some kinds of money that decent people don't accept. She'd taught those lessons every day, and she'd believed every word. Now her younger brother was alive because of money like that. The next morning, she called him, and an hour later, he was standing inside her third-floor apartment. He stood in the middle of the living room, in the exact place where he'd stood the first night he entered her home. Delaney placed a check on the dining table. "This is the full amount you paid for me. I don't have this much money, but I can repay you in installments. I'll sign an agreement and pay a certain amount every month, for as long as it takes." Nico looked at the check but didn't pick it up. "Delaney, let me finish." She stood across from him with her hands clasped tightly together. "You saved my brother. I'll owe you for that for the rest of my life, and I'll never say otherwise. But you also did something else." She drew a breath. "Yesterday, I stood across the street and watched the children leave school, and I realized I didn't dare walk through those gates anymore. Not because they suspended me, but because if they let me return tomorrow, I'd have to stand in front of 27 children and teach them what?" He remained silent. "I know where your money comes from, Nico. Everyone in this city knows. And I just accepted it. I can't look my students in the eyes anymore." Nico still didn't pick up the check. He told her he wanted to come back the following morning, and he asked her for 1 more hour, just one last time. At 9 o'clock the next morning, he arrived carrying a briefcase. He placed it on the dining table and opened it. Inside were documents nearly the width of a hand thick, arranged by year. He didn't say a word. He merely pushed the stack toward her. Delaney sat down and began to read. The first year contained the incorporation records for a legally registered port warehousing and transportation company with its own tax identification number. The third year contained the records terminating 2 former divisions, along with a list of 94 people who had been transferred into jobs with contracts and insurance. The 6th year contained an independent audit report. The 9th year contained the license for a logistics company registered in his name, along with records of the taxes it had paid. The 11th year contained the minutes of a meeting in which the names of 4 people who had opposed the changes were clearly recorded. She read for nearly an hour without skipping a single page. "What is all this?" 12 years, Nico said. He'd inherited that name when he was 22, and when he was 23, he'd begun dismantling it piece by piece. He still had about 15% left that he hadn't been able to convert. "Why haven't you finished?" "Because there's one person who won't let me." Delaney lowered the file onto the table. Nico pulled out a chair and sat across from her, and he made no attempt to take the documents back. "I didn't come here to convince you that I'm a good man. I'm not. There are things I've done that I'll never tell you about, not because I'm hiding them, but because I don't want you to have to carry them in your mind." He looked at her. "I came here to tell you only one thing." "What?" "If you tell me to stop, I'll sign all of this over to Bruno tonight, and I'll leave this city. You won't have to repay a single cent. You won't have to explain anything to anyone. And you'll never see me again." Delaney's head snapped up. "Are you serious?" "I'm leaving that decision to you." He rose, fastened the button of his jacket, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped, but he didn't turn around. "In 4 months of sitting on the streets, not one person ever asked what I wanted. Everyone simply decided for me." Then he left. Delaney remained alone with the open file on the table, and the check still lying untouched beside it. In her mind, she'd prepared every argument she would use if he tried to persuade her. She hadn't prepared for him to place the decision in her hands and walk away. 48 hours later, she called him. 6 days after that call, someone rang the bell of the third-floor apartment at 7 o'clock in the evening. Delaney opened the door and found a woman of about 31 standing alone in the hallway, with no one accompanying her. "Miss Shaw, I'm Sloane Marchetti. May I come in?" She didn't wait for an answer. She walked straight inside, crossed the living room, and stopped in the middle of the apartment. Very slowly, she looked around, taking in the sofa, the dining table with 4 chairs, 3 of which didn't match, and the door that still bore 2 old strips of adhesive no one had managed to scrape away completely. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting to be invited. "Has Nico told you about me?" "No. Of course not. He's never told anyone about me." Sloane opened her handbag, took out a piece of paper, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward Delaney. It was a check. Delaney looked at the amount written on it, $500,000. She remained standing where she was. Miss Marchetti, why are you here? My father and his father worked together for 30 years. I first met Nico when I was 6 years old, in my family's backyard. I know he hates answering the phone after 10 o'clock at night. I know he never sits with his back to a door. I know where he sat on the night his father didn't come home, and I was the one who sat beside him that night. Sloane tapped one finger against the check. I've known him for 25 years. How long have you known him? 3 months? Delaney walked to the table, picked up the check, and pushed it back toward her. Take it with you. Sloane made no move to accept it. Do you know why he still hasn't finished what he set out to do? Because of my father. All Nico needs is my father's signature, and everything he's worked toward for 12 years will finally be complete, and my father will sign if I tell him to. Then that's between you and him. Yes, Sloane said. It's always been between him and me, until you came along. She rose and slipped the strap of her handbag back over her shoulder. Let me put this plainly so you'll understand. You're a suspended elementary school teacher. You're in debt, and you have a younger brother who needs dialysis 3 times a week. The money on that table is enough to care for him for 10 years and buy you a house somewhere no one knows what happened at Bayard Hill. I'm not taking your money. Sloane looked at her for a long time, and for the first time that evening, she smiled. Do you think kindness makes you special? It doesn't. It only makes you easy to use. She walked to the door and opened it, then stopped at the threshold and looked back at the check, still lying on the dining table. I'm leaving it there. Miss Marchetti, I just told you to take it with you. I know, Sloane said. But everyone says that on the first day. 3 months from now, you'll understand why I didn't take it back. Then she closed the door behind her and left. Delaney stood alone in the living room with the $500,000 check lying face up on the dining table. She didn't pick it up. She didn't tear it apart either. After a while, she took a book from the shelf, slipped the check between 2 pages, returned the book to its place, and turned off the living room light. Nico arrived on Sunday afternoon, and he didn't bring a check with him. He didn't ask how much she needed either. He only said there were 2 places he wanted her to visit with him, and if she still wanted him to disappear afterward, he would. The first was a 2-story building on the west side, with old brick walls and a sign above the entrance that read Fayette Community Center. Inside was a classroom with 12 sets of desks and chairs, a small clinic that opened 3 times a week, and a kitchen. The silver-haired woman who ran the place greeted him by the name Nick, and she had no idea what his last name was. For 9 years now, this place has received money every single month, she told Delaney as she poured her a glass of water. It comes by bank transfer from a law office. No name. No one ever comes to take credit for it. I've asked and asked, but they won't tell me. Delaney turned to look at him, and he merely shrugged. The second place was 4 blocks away. It was a row of low houses with cracked concrete yards, and several children were playing ball at the end of the street. Nico stopped in front of the 3rd house from the corner. He'd lived there until he was 12. His father worked at the harbor, and his mother took in sewing. There were winters when they couldn't turn on the heat. He looked at the wooden door beneath its many layers of paint. When my father began making money, the people in this neighborhood greeted him more loudly. Then they started avoiding him. Then they stopped letting their children come to our house to play. I don't blame any of them. But when I was 12, I understood one thing. My father's name could buy a great many things, but it couldn't buy him a place in anyone's heart. The 2 of them stood there for a while. I'm not asking you to forgive me for what I inherited, Nico said. I have no right to ask that of you. I'm only asking you to look at what I'm trying to do with it. Delaney didn't give him an answer that day, but 3 days later, she returned to the Fayette Community Center alone, carrying a box of old books, and asked the silver-haired woman whether anyone used the classroom in the evenings. Beginning the following week, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evening, Delaney Shaw taught a class on the 2nd floor of the Fayette Community Center. There was no salary, no license, and no need for one, because it wasn't a school. 7 people came to the first class. By the 2nd week, there were 19. By the 3rd, they had to set out additional chairs in the hallway. There was a woman of 70 learning to read for the first time in her life. There was a young man who had left school in the 9th grade and came to prepare for his high school equivalency exam. There were 3 mothers who brought their children because they had no one to watch them, and the children sat at the back row coloring while their mothers studied. Nico came to pick her up at 9 o'clock at night. He never entered the classroom. He stood outside in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, and he remained there until the last person had gone home. Those 3 weeks were the most peaceful weeks Delaney had known since she was 16. Wyatt still underwent dialysis 3 times a week, and his numbers were more stable. She still didn't have an official job, still didn't know what would happen to her teaching license, and Sloane's check was still tucked inside the book on the shelf. But on the Friday evening of the 3rd week, when the woman of 70 stood and read an entire page aloud before the class and everyone applauded, Delaney began to laugh. She laughed freely and loudly, lifting both hands to cover her face. Nico stood in the hallway and watched her through the glass pane in the door. During 4 months on the streets, and throughout the 12 years before that, he had never seen anyone laugh that way. He didn't know it would be the last time he saw her laugh for a very long while. On Monday morning of the 4th week, Nico received an invitation to lunch. It didn't come by phone or text message. A driver came all the way to his office, handed Bruno a card with the name of a restaurant and the appointed time written by hand, then left. Nico looked at the card and told Bruno that the man had spent 30 years hoping he'd never have to do this. And now he had to. The restaurant in Little Italy was closed at that hour, opened privately for a single table. Salvatore Marchetti, 63 years old, sat at the head of the table in the back, his sleeves neatly rolled up, an untouched plate of pasta before him. He pointed to the chair at the opposite end. "Sit down, son." Nico sat. "Your father and I sat in these same 2 chairs 30 years ago. The table was shorter then." "I know." Salvatore poured water for both of them, slowly, without spilling a single drop. "For 12 years you've been selling it off piece by piece. You turned the harbor into a transportation company. You turned the warehouses into a logistics business. Your men now have employment contracts and health insurance. I sat back and watched. I didn't stand in your way because you're my friend's son. Then why won't you sign the final portion?" "Because I'm part of that final portion." He set the water pitcher down. "Do you think it's the money I can't let go of? I'm 63 years old. I couldn't spend it all even if I tried. What I can't let go of is 30 years. When your father died, I kept that name alive for him until you were old enough to carry it. Now you're asking me to sign a piece of paper that will make that name disappear. I'm not asking you to give it to me for nothing. I've made you 2 offers already. I don't need your money." Salvatore raised his eyes. "I need you to marry my daughter." Nico said nothing. For 25 years, Sloane has carried only one name in her mind, and you know that perfectly well. Marry her. The 2 families become one, and I'll sign everything. Clean and simple. No one loses anything. You know I don't love her. Your father didn't love your mother on the day they married either. 3 years later, he did. I'm sorry. I won't marry her." Salvatore nodded slowly, as though he'd known the answer before he came, and had only needed to hear it with his own ears. He picked up his napkin, folded it into quarters, and placed it beside his plate. "Then I'll tell you the price. If I pull out, I'll take 4 crews from the south side with me. Those 4 crews aren't as patient as I am, and they don't owe your father 30 years of loyalty." He spoke the next sentence in the same tone he'd used when speaking about the plate of pasta. "Families will lose people they love, son. Yours and mine. You're sitting here, so I know you can count them." "I can. You can count them, and you're still refusing?" "Yes." Salvatore looked at him for a long time, then pushed back his chair and rose. He hadn't raised his voice once throughout the meal, and he didn't raise it now. "There's one way you're like your father. You both believe you're the one who gets to decide." He draped his coat over his arm. "Very well. You've given me your answer. Now I'll ask her." Nico's head snapped up. "What are you going to do?" But Salvatore Marchetti had already reached the door. He didn't look back, and he didn't answer. On Wednesday evening, Delaney had just finished teaching her class at the Fayette Community Center, and was putting the desks and chairs back in place when Sloane Marchetti walked into the classroom. She didn't knock. She looked around at the 12 old desks and chairs, the half-erased writing on the whiteboard, and the box of used books in the corner, then pulled out a chair and sat down. "Sit down, Miss Shaw. I said this would only take 5 minutes." Delaney remained standing. Sloane opened her handbag, took out 2 sheets of paper, and placed them side by side on a student's desk. The first was a typed list. It had no title. There were only names arranged in 2 columns, with a number beside each one. Delaney read the first line, a name, followed by the number 4. The second line held another name, followed by the number 2. "What is this?" The column on the right is the number of children they have, Sloane said. 31 names. If my father withdraws from the agreement, 4 crews on the south side will follow him, and these families will be caught in the middle. I'm not saying something will happen to all of them. I'm saying there will be families who lose someone they love. My father told Nico that plainly on Monday, and he still refused. Delaney looked down at the paper, but she couldn't bring herself to read another name. The second sheet was a printout from the hospital system. Delaney recognized it immediately. Patient name, Wyatt Shaw. The status line read temporary hold. Beneath it was a note stating that the financial records didn't meet eligibility requirements and were awaiting further review. Sloane placed one finger on the second sheet. My father has served on that hospital's funding board for 19 years. He doesn't have to do anything wrong. He only has to do nothing. What do you want? Leave him. Delaney stood motionless. The only sound in the classroom was the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. You leave him. My father signs the final portion, and Nico's 12 years of work will be complete. This list won't be needed, and your brother's file will be returned to active status within 24 hours. And you'll marry him. Sloane didn't deny it. She simply looked at Delaney. I've waited 25 years, Miss Shaw. If you could wait 3 months, I can wait too. What if I tell him about all of this? Then my father withdraws tonight. Sloane rose and slipped her handbag over her shoulder. Listen carefully, because I'll only say this once. You have 24 hours, and he has to believe you never loved him. She looked straight into Delaney's eyes. Nico isn't an easy man to deceive. If he suspects even the slightest thing, if he starts asking questions, if he believes you were forced, then this agreement is void. Both of these papers become worthless. Sloane walked to the door, then stopped. I'll tell you one last thing, and I'm not saying it to make you hate me more. She turned back. I told you before, kindness doesn't make you special. It only makes you the one person in this story who can be used as a bargaining chip. Then she left. Delaney remained alone in the second-floor classroom, surrounded by 12 old desks and chairs, with the 2 sheets of paper lying side by side on the desk. Delaney didn't sleep at all that night. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she took the book down from the shelf, opened it, pulled out the $500,000 check tucked between 2 pages, and placed it on the dining table. Then she sat staring at it until daylight came. At 6 o'clock the following evening, she sent him a single message, telling him to come over. Nico arrived at 7. He'd come straight from work and was still wearing his suit, and he walked in with the expression of a man expecting to hear good news. You called me? Delaney stood at the head of the dining table. The check lay face up on the tabletop, its amount turned toward him. Nico looked at the check, then at her. Where did this come from? Sloane Marchetti gave it to me, several weeks ago. He said nothing. I've thought about it very carefully. Delaney heard her own voice coming out calm, even, and clear, exactly as she'd practiced throughout the night. I accepted it. Nico remained where he was. Say that again. I accepted it, and I don't want you to come here anymore. Why? Because I'm tired. She lifted her eyes and looked directly into his, refusing to let herself blink. Over the past 4 months, I've lost my job, my teaching license, my place in the classroom, and even my good name in the newspapers. My brother is lying in a hospital waiting to die because of a single line in their system. And all you showed me was a 2-story building on the west side and a cracked concrete yard. Delaney, do you know what I thought? She continued, not allowing him to interrupt. That night, when I carried that bowl of soup out and placed it in front of you, I saw your hands trembling, and I thought, this man will never forget that bowl of soup. Nico didn't move. I'm 28 years old. I work 2 shifts a day, and I owe $4,200. What do you think I sat on those steps for 3 weeks for? Because I'm kind? She picked up the check. It was an investment, Nico, and now it's finally paid off. The room remained silent for a very long time. Nico didn't ask another question. He didn't ask who had given her the check or why she was revealing it now. He didn't ask why a woman would keep that check in her home for weeks without touching it. He didn't ask why her voice was so even tonight, as even as someone reciting words she'd memorized. He only looked at her, and for the first time in 12 years, he chose not to see what was right before his eyes. All right, he said. Just 2 words. Delaney picked up her bag and walked past him toward the door. He didn't reach out. He didn't call her name. He didn't take a single step after her. She opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and closed it behind her. Then she walked 4 steps and stopped. She leaned back against the wall of the 3rd-floor hallway, clutching the check to her chest with both hands, and stood there for a very long time. The check in her hands was still folded exactly as it had been when Sloane placed it on the dining table that evening. Throughout the weeks, it had remained inside the book on the shelf, and throughout this entire night, she hadn't unfolded it even once. Inside the apartment, Nico remained in the same spot for nearly 10 more minutes. Then he went downstairs and out to the car. Bruno opened the door for him and studied his employer's face. "Boss, what happened?" Nico settled into the back seat and stared through the window. "Pull everyone out of this neighborhood. The entire Monument Street route. Starting tonight," Bruno faltered. "Sir, she still works evenings at the Fayette Center. I said pull everyone out." The car had traveled 2 blocks when Bruno spoke again. "Boss, let me find out what happened. This isn't like her. I haven't been wrong about a person in 30 years. "You're forbidden to investigate her," Nico said. "Sir, I don't want to know." Bruno looked at his employer through the rearview mirror. Nico was still facing the window, and Bruno saw the man's shoulders sink slightly, as though he'd finally laid down something he'd been carrying for far too long. "I've been waiting 12 years for this day, Bruno. Waiting for the day someone finally told me they came because of the money." His voice was very soft. "Now that I've heard it, I don't have to wait anymore. Don't look into anything. If you find another reason, I'll start hoping again. And I won't do that to myself one more time." Exactly 24 hours after that night, Delaney called the hospital, and the transplant coordinator confirmed that patient Wyatt Shaw's file had been returned to active status on the waiting list. She thanked her, hung up, and sat motionless in the living room chair for an entire hour. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the State Board of Education, concluding that there weren't sufficient grounds to revoke her teaching license permanently, and her license was reinstated with a note placed in her record. But no school in Baltimore called her for an interview again. She submitted 11 applications and received 4 rejection letters, while the other 7 schools remained silent. The article from that day was still online, and anyone who typed in her name found it at the top of the results. The 12th application she sent went farther away, to a county in the western part of the state, nearly a 3-hour drive from the city. The elementary school there had 40 students across all 5 grades, and only 2 teachers, and they'd been searching for someone for a year and a half without success. The principal called her once, asked her 3 questions, then asked if she could start the following Monday. He didn't mention the article. She later learned that he'd never read it and had no intention of doing so. Delaney moved away at the end of February. She rented a small house 4 minutes from the school on foot. Wyatt remained in the city because his dialysis center was there, and every 2 weeks, she drove back, leaving at 4 o'clock on Saturday morning so she could get him to his 6:15 appointment. Her classroom held multiple grade levels. 40 children from 6 to 11 years old sat together in one room, divided into 4 groups in 4 corners, and during every lesson, she made 4 rounds through the classroom. The youngest group practiced writing letters. The oldest worked on long division. There were no free periods, no tutoring sessions, and no teacher's lounge where she could walk in and watch everyone fall silent. On her first morning standing in the middle of that classroom, she thought she wouldn't be able to manage it. By the 3rd week, she knew the names of all 40 children. She carried the $500,000 check with her in a box of belongings when she moved. She placed it in the bottom drawer of the desk in her bedroom, beneath the stack of Wyatt's insurance papers, and never touched it again. She paid the rent with her salary. She paid for the gas to drive back to the city with her salary. The heater broke in April, and she waited until May before she could afford to have it repaired. There were nights when she sat at the table with her expense book and a pen, calculating the numbers over and over again, while the bottom drawer was only an arm's reach from where she sat. She never opened it, because that night in the 3rd-floor apartment, she'd stood before him and said she'd done everything for money. If she spent even a single dollar of that money now, the lie she'd told would become the truth. And that was the only thing she had left that she could still keep for herself. What happened at Bayard Hill came to light in May, and it came to light for one simple reason. After the school received a $40,000 grant, the district sent people to conduct an inventory of its property, and they required every purchase record from the previous 3 years to be checked against the items physically present in storage. Priscilla Dunn assigned Bethany Cole to prepare the reconciliation report. Bethany worked on it for 2 weeks, signed her name on every page, and submitted it. When the district inspectors discovered that more than $200,000 worth of property had gone missing over 6 years, the only person whose signature appeared throughout the entire reconciliation file was Bethany. Priscilla told the inspectors that she'd delegated responsibility for managing the property to Miss Cole long ago, and that she deeply regretted placing her trust in the wrong person. Bethany sat in the meeting room that day and heard every word. 3 days later, she carried a cardboard box into the district office. Inside were copies of everything Priscilla had made her sign over the course of 6 years, papers Bethany had quietly photocopied each time because she was afraid, along with 14 messages Priscilla had sent her, including one telling her to simply sign because someone else would take care of the rest. There was another document in the box. It was a quarterly expense statement containing an entry for 12 digital projectors at $1,100 each, for a total of $13,200. It was the same document Delaney Shaw had brought upstairs to ask about one October afternoon, only to have it folded in half and placed inside a drawer. Priscilla Dunn was suspended that very day, and 6 weeks later, she was charged with embezzling public property over a period of 6 years. At trial, her attorney said that his client had devoted 17 years of her life to education. The judge asked whether she had anything she wished to say. Priscilla replied that she had nothing to say. The very thing she'd once told Delaney was best left unseen was ultimately the thing that brought her before the court. In June, the Bayard Hill School Board issued a public statement, sent it to every parent, and posted it on the district website. It stated that every allegation involving Miss Delaney Shaw was without foundation, that the previous suspension had been removed entirely from her personnel file, and that the board offered her a formal apology. The local newspaper reprinted the statement on page 11. The old article on the city news site remained exactly where it had always been. At the end of June, an old car stopped outside the small house in the western part of the state, 4 minutes from the school on foot. Bethany Cole had driven 3 hours to get there. She stood outside on the porch but couldn't bring herself to step onto the front stairs. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I only came to tell you one thing." Delaney stood in the doorway. "I took that picture. I was the first one to send it to the group chat. At the time, I thought it was only a harmless joke." Bethany spoke, and her voice broke. "It wasn't until they pushed me forward to take the blame that I understood how you must have felt the day you carried that box out of the school. Delaney, I'm sorry." Delaney looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you for driving all this way." She didn't invite her inside. Bethany nodded, turned back toward her car, and Delaney remained in the doorway, watching until the car disappeared completely at the end of the road. Bruno Sarti waited exactly 3 months. During those 3 months, he went to work every day, opened the car door for his boss every morning, and never once mentioned the name Delaney Shaw. He didn't investigate either. He did only one thing. He kept a record. He recorded that his boss skipped lunch 4 days a week. He recorded that the meetings concerning the final transition were postponed 3 times, then stopped altogether. He recorded that on some nights, the light in the upstairs office remained on until morning. On the 92nd day, Bruno drove away without telling anyone. On Thursday morning, he walked into Nico's office, closed the door behind him, and placed 3 things on the desk. "What is this? You can fire me if you want. But first, you're going to listen to all 3 of these." The first was an audio recording. Bruno played it. Sloane Marchetti's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, recorded by a phone hidden inside the pocket of a coat hanging in the second-floor classroom at the Fayette Community Center, where she hung her coat on the same hook every evening. "You have 24 hours, and he has to believe you never loved him. If he suspects even the slightest thing, if he starts asking questions, if he believes you were forced, then this agreement is void." Nico sat motionless. Who recorded this? The elderly woman who looks after the center. She heard an argument, so she turned on the recorder. She's kept it for 3 months because she didn't know who to give it to. The second item was a thin stack of papers. It contained a list of the hospital's funding board members spanning 19 years, including the name Salvatore Marchetti. Attached were 2 printouts showing the status of patient Wyatt Shaw's file, taken exactly 24 hours apart. The first read temporary hold, the second read active. Nico read both pages, and Bruno saw his hand stop at the date. The date on the second printout was the day after the night Delaney had stood at the head of the dining table and told him it had all been an investment. And this? Bruno pushed the third document toward him. It was a bank statement from an account in Sloane Marchetti's name. showing the entry connected to the $500,000 check, the issue date, the check number, and the status column. Not presented. Nico stared at those words. Not presented meant no one had ever taken that check to the bank. Not to withdraw part of it. Not to transfer it into another account. Not to sign it over to anyone else. It's been 9 months, Bruno said. That money is still sitting untouched in Miss Marchetti's account. Miss Shaw hasn't taken a single dollar. A recording can be edited. The hospital records could be dismissed as a coincidence, but no one can fake this, boss. When someone takes a $500,000 check home and leaves it untouched for 9 months, there's only one reason. Nico shot to his feet. He stood there with both hands braced against the desk, staring at the 3 pieces of evidence before him for a very long time without speaking. Then he said, his voice turning hoarse, "She lied to save me." Bruno didn't answer. 3 months ago, I stood 2 steps away from her. I saw everything. I saw her reciting every word from memory like a child repeating a lesson. I saw her hand trembling when she picked up that check. Nico raised his head. I knew she was lying, Bruno. I knew it right then. Then why didn't you ask? Because I'd been waiting 12 years to hear those words, he said. And once I finally heard them, I felt relieved, because at last, I was right. Nico walked toward the window. I would rather believe she wanted the money than consider the possibility that someone was willing to give up everything to save me, because if that was true, then I left her all alone. He fell silent for several seconds. And that's exactly what I did. I left her all alone. Nico Ferraro didn't go to see Salvatore Marchetti. He didn't call, didn't send a message, and didn't send anyone to negotiate. He did something else. On Monday morning, he summoned every leader in the organization to a conference room on the 14th floor of the office building bearing the name of his logistics company, and he invited 2 attorneys and an independent auditing firm to sit at the far end of the table. On the table lay the 12 years' worth of records Delaney had spent nearly an hour reading in the 3rd-floor apartment. Nico spoke for no more than 10 minutes. He said the final 15% would be transferred that very day, without waiting for anyone else's signature. He said all the assets, warehouses, transportation contracts, and 270 employees would be placed under a single legal entity, with audits, taxes, and employment contracts. Anyone who wanted to stay could sign the contract placed before them. Anyone who didn't could stand up and walk out the door, and no one would stop them. Then he delivered his final sentence. Beginning that afternoon, not $1 belonging to the organization would ever pass through Salvatore Marchetti's hands again. There were 21 people in the room, 19 signed. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the old contracts with 4 groups on the south side of the city had all been terminated according to their terms. Every payment had been made in full, and the records had been signed and acknowledged by attorneys. There wasn't a sound. No one was harmed. Salvatore Marchetti woke on Tuesday morning with 30 years of connections still in his hands, and not a single dollar flowing through them. He made 11 phone calls that day. 9 went unanswered. On Thursday afternoon, the attorney representing the new organization sent a set of documents to the hospital's funding board, accompanied by a certificate guaranteeing lifelong treatment expenses for patient Wyatt Shaw to be paid by a legally recognized, independently audited foundation, whose name wasn't concealed. On Friday morning, Wyatt's file was restored to active status. 3 weeks later, a matching kidney became available. Delaney started driving at 4 o'clock in the morning and sat in the 4th-floor hallway for 7 hours, on the very row of plastic chairs where she'd sat alone the day they told her she wasn't a match. The surgery was successful. Wyatt woke that afternoon, saw his sister, and the first thing he asked was whether she'd eaten. Delaney burst into tears right there in the hospital hallway. That same afternoon, nearly 20 miles from the hospital, Sloane Marchetti sat alone in the living room of her father's house. On the television screen, a local news station was covering the announcement of a new scholarship fund for disadvantaged students in Baltimore. The reporter read the fund's name. The Shaw Scholarship Fund. The camera swept across the auditorium and stopped on the man standing at the podium. He didn't mention anyone's name. He only said the fund had been created because there had once been a classroom on the east side of the city where 27 children shared 19 books, and because the person who'd told him those numbers had no idea they would ever reach this far. Sloane sat motionless. She'd devoted 25 years to this. She'd used her father's name, the hospital board, a $500,000 check, and even a list of 31 names as bargaining tools. She'd fought for him with everything she possessed. But that other woman had never fought to claim anything at all. She'd simply set down a loaf of bread and her last $20 beside a stranger sitting by the roadside, then walked away without waiting to be thanked. Sloane remembered the words she'd spoken to that woman twice, both times in a voice filled with pity. Kindness doesn't make you special. It only makes you easy to exploit. She sat in the empty room of a house where the telephone hadn't rung in weeks, and she finally understood that for 25 years, the schoolteacher hadn't been the one who was wrong. On a Friday afternoon near the end of September, Delaney's classes ended at 3 o'clock, and she went out to the schoolyard to remind the children waiting for the bus to stay inside the fence. She counted all 40 heads, then looked up and saw him. Nico Ferraro stood beyond the wooden fence, about 10 steps away from her. No suit, no car, no one beside him. He'd come on foot, and he was wearing the old coat worn thin at the elbows, her father's coat, the one she'd given him on a cold, windy afternoon beside a brick wall. Delaney stood motionless in the middle of the schoolyard. 40 children boarded the bus, and the bus pulled away, and a little while later, only 2 people remained in the yard. He didn't come through the gate. He stayed where he was, outside the fence. I know everything now. The check, the list, the conversation in the second-floor classroom. Delaney didn't answer. I didn't come here to apologize for believing you. I didn't believe you, Delaney. That night, I stood 2 steps away from you, and I knew you were lying. Then why didn't you ask? Because I was afraid, he said. For 12 years, I kept waiting for the day someone would tell me they'd come for the money. When you said it, I felt relieved, because it meant I'd been right all along. If I'd asked one more question, just one, I would have had to face something I wasn't brave enough to see, that someone was willing to give up everything to save me. Nico rested his hand on the wooden rail of the fence. I'm not afraid of Salvatore Marchetti. I'm afraid of you. Delaney stepped a little closer. Do you know how I've lived these past 9 months? I do. I sat across the street from your house for 3 hours in May, when your heater broke. I didn't dare knock on the door. She looked at him. You once told me there was a time when you needed someone's help, and no one came, Nico said. I'm 12 years late, but I'm here now. Delaney stood there for a very long time. Then she crossed the final 3 steps, lifted the latch on the wooden gate, and stepped outside the fence. They were married the following April, in a small church 4 minutes from the school on foot. There were no reporters, no procession of cars, and no one guarding the door. Wyatt was 20, healthy and back at work, and he held his sister's hand as he walked her all the way down the aisle. Margie Doyle sat in the second row. The 70-year-old woman from the Fayette Community Center read a short passage, finishing every word without stumbling once. Bayard Hill School was renovated that summer with money from the school district and a contribution from the Shaw Scholarship Fund. The roof over the west classroom wing was completely replaced, and the plastic bucket beneath the 3rd row of desks was no longer needed. The 4th grade class had enough books for every child. Micah Turner was 10 when he returned to his old classroom for the new school year, and he sat at the very first desk. 1 month before the wedding, someone rang the bell at the little house in the western part of the state. Sloane Marchetti stood alone on the porch, without makeup, holding an envelope in her hand. Inside was the $500,000 check Delaney had mailed back that summer. I didn't come to give this back to you, Sloane said. I came to tell you I was wrong, and that I've known exactly when I was wrong for a long time. I didn't just realize it now. Delaney stood in the doorway and listened to every word. Miss Marchetti, I forgive you. Sloane looked up. I mean it, Delaney said. I forgive you because I don't want to carry this with me for the rest of my life. But I won't invite you into my home, and we won't see each other again. Some things can be forgiven, but that doesn't mean you can go back. Sloane nodded. She thanked her, then turned toward her car, and Delaney watched until the vehicle had disappeared completely from sight. Some things in life can't be measured in money. Delaney Shaw gave away her dinner on a day when she had only $20 left in her wallet, and that was true kindness. The kind given when a person has nothing left in their hands. A person's worth isn't found in the balance of a bank account, but in how they treat someone who has nothing to offer in return. And there are old wounds we should forgive, not to ease the heart of the person who caused them, but to free ourselves to keep moving forward. The story of Delaney Shaw and the man by the school gate has now come to an end. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who, like you, believes that kindness is never meaningless. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can hear more beautiful and moving stories every day. How did today's story make you feel? Do you agree that kindness given when we have nothing left in our hands is the truest kind of kindness? Please leave a comment below. We're always grateful to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace with each passing day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.